Jerusalem was a city held in the grip of the Passover. Outside, the stone streets hummed with the restless energy of thousands. Merchants shouted, fires crackled in the alleys, and the smell of roasting lamb drifted thick through the narrow passages. It was a night of noise, of movement, and of expectation. Then, the heavy wooden door of the upper room swung shut, and the world vanished. The transition was absolute. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the scent of bitter herbs and the lingering warmth of the day. 12 men sat around the low table, their shadows stretching long against the plastered walls. Jesus sat at the center, his presence anchoring the room. No one spoke. The frantic pulse of the city outside felt like a memory from another life. Here, the silence was not empty. It was pressurized, waiting. The disciples shifted on the floor, their movements muted, their eyes fixed on the man at the head of the table. A single oil lamp flickered, casting a rhythmic, golden light. Jesus looked at them, one by one, and the silence deepened. The festival continued beyond the walls, but inside, the clock had stopped. Jesus rose from the table. The movement was slow, deliberate, and drew every eye in the room. He reached for the heavy fabric at his shoulders, loosening the fastenings until the outer layer fell away. He set it aside on the stone floor. The disciples watched, their hands resting on their knees, their breathing shallow. He took a coarse, woven towel from a hook on the wall and wrapped it firmly around his waist. The fabric was rough, utilitarian, and stark against the dim light. He walked to the corner of the room, lifted a large ceramic basin, and set it down in the center of the floor. He poured water from a heavy jug. The liquid splashed against the basin, a clear, rhythmic sound that cut through the stifling air. He knelt. The motion was fluid, bringing him level with the floor. He reached out, his fingers steady, and placed his hands on the edge of the basin. He dipped his hands into the water, the surface rippling outward, and turned toward the first man in the circle. Jesus moved along the line of men, the basin held steady in his hands. When he reached Peter, the disciple did not reach out. He pulled his feet back, tucking them beneath his knees. His hands gripped the edge of his seat, knuckles white, his breath hitching in the quiet room. "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Peter asked. His voice was thin, strained by the impropriety of the act. Jesus did not pause. He knelt, the movement slow and deliberate, and placed the basin on the stone floor. He looked up, his gaze meeting Peter's with absolute clarity. "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter stared at him, his jaw tight, his shoulders hunched. He looked at the water, then back at the face of his teacher. The resistance drained out of his posture as he realized the impossibility of refusal. He slowly extended his feet toward the basin. Jesus reached out, his fingers firm and cool against the skin. He washed the dust from the soles, the water swirling in the basin, and dried them with the rough towel. Jesus stood, walked back to the center of the table, and took his place. He did not sit immediately. He looked at the faces around him, his expression hardening. The room was still, the air thick with the scent of roasted lamb and bitter herbs. He leaned forward, his hands flat against the rough wood of the table. "A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Love one another." The disciples shifted. They exchanged glances, their brows furrowed, trying to reconcile the act of the basin with the weight of the words. Then, the rhythm of the room snapped. Jesus paused, his gaze darkening, pulling away from the group. "One of you will betray me." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a physical pressure, a vacuum that sucked the breath from the air. Then, the room erupted. Questions tumbled over one another, sharp and frantic. "Is it I?" they asked, one by one, their voices rising in a jagged chorus of denial. Judas Iscariot sat at the far end of the table. He did not look up. His hands gripped the edge of the wood, his knuckles turning white as bone. The questions died in the air as the disciples turned toward the end of the table. Judas did not look up. He kept his gaze fixed on the wood, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid bursts. The silence in the room became heavy, a physical weight pressing against the walls. Then, without a word, Judas pushed his stool back. The wood scraped harshly against the stone floor, a jagged sound that made the others flinch. He stood, his movements stiff and mechanical. He did not meet the eyes of the man sitting next to him, nor did he look at Jesus. He turned toward the door, his steps heavy and deliberate. He reached for the iron latch, his fingers trembling as he gripped the cold metal. The door swung open, and a gust of wind rushed into the room, fluttering the flames of the oil lamps. He stepped out, his silhouette framed for a heartbeat against the vast, ink-black sky beyond. The door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the sudden, hollow quiet. The remaining 11 sat frozen, their faces pale in the flickering light. The silence left by the departing figure lingered, thick and suffocating. Jesus did not acknowledge the empty seat. He turned his gaze back to the 11, his eyes steady, cutting through the confusion that clouded their faces. He reached for the loaf of bread resting on the center of the table. The crust was dry, crumbling slightly under his palms. He held it up, the light of the oil lamps catching the rough texture of the grain. With a deliberate, slow motion, he snapped the bread in two. He handed a piece to the man nearest him, then another. "Take and eat," he said, his voice low and resonant. "This is my body." He then lifted the cup of wine. His fingers traced the rim, the metal cool against his skin. He held it steady. "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many, for the forgiveness of sins. On my." The disciples stared at the bread, then at the cup, their fingers trembling as they reached out. The gravity of the words hit them. Peter surged forward, his chair skidding back against the stone floor with a sharp, jarring screech. He slammed his palms onto the table, his knuckles white and his breathing ragged. "Lord," he declared, his voice cutting through the heavy air with a desperate, raw intensity, "I will lay down my life for you. I will follow you anywhere, even to the end." He leaned in, his eyes searching Jesus' face for a flicker of doubt, his jaw set in a line of stubborn defiance. The other disciples watched, their own hands gripping the edges of their seats, waiting for a sign. Jesus did not flinch. He looked at Peter, his expression unmoving, a profound and quiet sorrow etched into the lines around his eyes. He shook his head slowly. "Before the rooster crows," Jesus said, his voice steady and rhythmic, "you will disown me 3 times." The words landed like stones in a pool. Peter froze, his mouth opening as if to protest, but the sound died in his throat. The defiance drained from his face, replaced by a sudden, hollow shock. He pulled his hands back from the table, his fingers trembling, and sank back into his seat. The silence returned, deeper and colder than before. The air in the room felt thin, as if the oxygen had been pulled away by the weight of the prophecy. Jesus remained seated for a moment, his gaze drifting past the disciples, past the stone walls, toward the rafters above. He took a slow, deep breath, the movement of his chest rhythmic and steady. Then, he lifted his head, his eyes fixed toward the ceiling, and began to speak. The tone of his voice shifted, losing the sharp edge of the earlier warning, replaced by a calm, resonant flow that seemed to fill the corners of the room. He spoke of a vine and its branches, of a place being prepared, and of a counselor who would come to guide them when he was gone. The disciples leaned in, their shoulders brushing, their faces illuminated by the dying flicker of the oil lamps. They listened as he prayed, his words weaving a tapestry of protection and unity for all who would believe. He asked that they be kept safe, that they be one, just as he and the Father were one. The sound of his voice was the only thing holding back the encroaching shadows of the night. As he finished, the room felt momentarily anchored, the frantic pulse of their fear replaced by a quiet, heavy stillness. He lowered his head, his eyes meeting theirs one last time, and the prayer ended. The final word of the prayer hung in the air, then dissolved into the quiet. Jesus stood, and the disciples followed, the scrape of wood against stone sounding unnaturally loud. They began to sing. It was a thin, fragile melody, their voices rising together in a hymn that seemed to struggle against the oppressive weight of the night. They stood close, shoulders touching, a small circle of sound in the vast, dark room. As the last note faded, the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. They moved toward the door, their steps measured and slow. One by one, they crossed the threshold, leaving the warmth of the room behind. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. Jerusalem was asleep, the narrow streets empty and still. Their sandals clicked rhythmically against the uneven cobblestones, a steady, repetitive beat that echoed off the high stone walls of the alleyways. They walked in a tight formation, their heads low, their eyes scanning the darkness for threats that were not there. The city offered no comfort. It was a labyrinth of shadows and sleeping houses. They turned toward the gate, moving steadily toward the Mount of Olives. With every step, the distance between them and the safety of the room grew, and the weight of the coming hours pressed down on them. The path ahead was already marked, not by light, but by the looming, silent shadow of the cross waiting in the dark.